Greetings, everyone. In this podcast episode, we met with Dr. Cheskes to discuss his amazing dose VF study. All the links will be found in the show notes. In this episode, prepare to learn why don't we start with double sequential defibrillation or vector change versus standard defibrillation. What is the optimal time between defibrillations if you're performing a double sequential defibrillation? And should we continue with vector change or double sequential defibrillation if a patient converts but then subsequently rearrests in a shockable rhythm? You'll learn that and much more in this episode. We hope you enjoy. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cheskes. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. Fantastic. Great to meet both you guys today and learn a little bit about your backgrounds and now hopefully provide you some insights into double sequential defibrillation. So really excited to be here.
We know you'll give an amazing talk. Do you mind giving a brief introduction about your background and just the dose VF trial in an overview?
Yeah, for sure. So my background, I'm the medical director, as everyone I think knows, of Sunnybrook Center for Pre-Hospital Medicine, and I'm the medical director specifically for PO and Halton. Academically, I'm a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Toronto and a scientist at Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute at St. Mike's, affiliate scientist at Sunnybrook Research Institute. So obviously have a fair amount of interest in the world of research, in the world of science. And really my research over the years has really been focused on resuscitation science. So in my original work, I've done work in STEMI. I think from a resuscitation point of view, my major work was really on CPR quality. I always felt that was going to be really important. Did I think some sentinel work in the area of shock pause, so pre-shock pause, peri-shock pause. I've done some interesting research in the area of STEMI. And then, really dose VF came around. So, dose VF, as everyone knows, was a trial that wanted to explore whether alternate defibrillation strategies such as vector change or double sequential were superior to standard defibrillation for patients in refractory VF. There was a lot of observational research in this particular area prior to the start of the study. But the observational research was really quite flawed in the fact that most of the time the intervention was delivered very late in a resuscitation, and delivering anything late in a resuscitation, particularly cardiac arrest, is generally doomed to failure. So I think the beauty of this sort of trial design was one that it was a 3-arm study, so it had vector change as one of the arms. The intervention was going to be delivered early, so after 3 failed shocks, as opposed to late, and it was a randomized trial. Right. So it's really, you can't really compare that to previous observational research from a scientific point of view. The science we feel was much stronger than previous observational research. So I think that was the big sort of overview. People always ask me, Shel, why did you even get into DSED? Do you know what I mean? And I think, we've been doing DSED for a period of time, much longer than this trial went on. But we had a case back now, it's got to be at least 8 or 9 years ago, where we had a 21-year-old female who was 1 month postpartum. And she went into refractory VF. She had 5 shocks given, epi, amiodarone, and the paramedic patched to Sunnybrook at that time. And the paramedic had heard of this concept of DSED. I must have been talking about it already at that point, and patched for the use of DSED in the field. And I think the patch physician said, Jesus, I don't know what you're talking about, but if Cheskes said it's okay, go ahead and do it, okay? And the patient got DSED, got ROSC, survived the hospital discharge, perfectly normal, to go home to her 1-month-old child. So after that case, I was completely sold. I said, we need to look at this and we need to change practice. We need to do a study that actually has the potential to change practice. And I think that's why the paramedics were so engaged in dose VF. I don't think I've ever done a trial where the paramedics were so engaged. And I think the reason for that was one, we involved everyone, right? So both ALS and BLS paramedics. So in my experience, the more you involve BLS paramedics, PCPs, the more likely your trial is going to be bought in by the paramedics. I think the paramedics thought, wow, man, this is really cool. We're going to give extra heat here. Do you know what I mean? We're going to give more energy. This wasn't just a little more amio, a little bit more epi. This was actually doing something quite different. And I think also there was no question in my mind an impression amongst the paramedics that this could theoretically change practice if it was successful. And I think being involved in a practice changing resuscitation trial is almost unheard of. As many of you know, we've done resuscitation trials over the years, and essentially none of them turn out positive, okay, for whatever reason. But this one had to, obviously at the end of the day, turned out positive. And I think that thought really made a big difference. And I think the final thing is for paramedics. Paramedics love to know what happened at the end of their resuscitation, right? They love to know that. So here, you have patients going into refractory VF, they receive DSED, and boom, they have ROS, right? So for a paramedic seeing that after multiple times failing with standard defibrillation, that like spreads like wildfire through the service. That really did. People said, "Well, we did this new technique. The patient got ROS. By the time we got to emerge, the patient was waking up, and they take them to the cath lab." Like that really spread through the service a lot. So you can imagine, right? If you have a little bit more amio, a little bit more epi, you don't know the end result down the road, but here you saw the result right away. So I think those were all reasons I think that the paramedics really sort of bought into the trial.
And you hear that, I think, when you talk to the paramedics about it, is you always talk about big data and the number of patients that will present in refractory and with multiple shocks, and you wouldn't anticipate as many people to say, let me tell you about this call I did. And almost everyone that you talk about this to goes, I know the exact patient this would have been beneficial on in my career. And I think you're totally right, is they can then apply that and say, well, if that would have worked, I need to do this next time. So I think it's pretty cool to see and have that immediate potential for change, right?
And I think one of the things that we've seen is, and I tell people this, it's hard to believe, the trial now, was published November 2022 in New England Journal. So we're almost 2 years now, right? I still get 2 to 3 emails every week from a physician, a paramedic, an ICU doc, an emerge doc from around the world, always around the world, saying, hey, you know what? Thanks for your study. We did DSED in a patient and the patient survived, and they would have survived if not for that intervention. So that tells you that this is something that is not just EMS, right? And most of my talks I give now actually are not EMS, surprisingly. They are to EDs, ICU, critical care, cath labs, because this is where refractory VF actually does take place. So it's one of the few times, think about EMS. In EMS, generally the interventions we do in the field are based on things that are done in the hospital, so emerge medicine, etc. This is probably one of the first trials that I know of where an intervention done in the field changed practice in the hospital. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty rare to see that actually reversed from what most people see. So yeah, I think getting that feedback from others around the world really makes you feel like you've accomplished something.
Absolutely, and I think so. I think one of the interesting things that we were chatting about before was one of the comments you made about access to a defibrillator. And in Ontario, we are fairly fortunate that in general, we will typically have access to at least one, if not multiple defibrillators on a scene. And that kind of leads into some of the questions that we've gotten from the paramedics as we've been delivering this education around the use of fire department defibrillators. And I know that was a part of the study. And one of their concerns, which I'm sure was something that was addressed and thought about in the study, is they're saying, well, isn't there going to be a pause? So I'm using another monitor in an SAED mode. It kind of goes back to some of that other research on perishock pause and all that kind of stuff. So they have a concern where they feel as though that may be the inferior intervention, despite the evidence not necessarily pointing to that direction, because they're concerned about the amount of time that it might take for the SAD to analyze, which we try to dispel by actually doing the physical practice. So showing them that, it's not the 1980s. This is actually a very sophisticated monitor that the fire department is carrying, and we're not looking at substantial delay. But perhaps you could speak to it from like the research side of the arm. Was that a concern or anything that you found when doing the trial?
So I think, some of the initial, criticism of the trial was that you needed 2 manual defibrillators to do it, which was clearly criticism by people who've never done DSED, because we've done DSED with a manual and AED. We've done it with 2 AEDs. We've done it with an AED first, manual second. We've done it with a Lucas device. We've done it with an auto pulse. You can do it with all these. And what I'll do after this call, I'll share with you our training videos where we show you specifically how it's done with an AED. And the critical piece of doing it with an AED is synchronizing the CPR to the charging segment of the AED, and that's the key. So, in our process, we know the Zoll AED takes 15 seconds from the time you press the charge button till it's analyzing. So what we do when we put on the AED and someone has already got a manual defibrillator on, when we're at a minute 45 of the 2-minute CPR cycle, we then hit the turn on button of the AED. And then by the time the AED charges up, both the analysis pieces are synchronized. So then you don't have any issue about synchronization whatsoever. So that process can be done with any AED. You just need to know the time to power on to analysis of that particular AED. So many systems generally use 1 or 2 AEDs. It's very easy to do and very easy to teach, and you'll see this in the slide. So we had no trouble with it. And AEDs that we have out there deliver energy just as good as manual defibrillators, right? What I would probably say to you, what I don't want to get misinterpreted, is our preference is to use a fire department, so a first responder who's being sent to a 911 call. What we're not advocating for in general is the use of bystander AEDs. So an AED on the street, an AED at a rink, right? It can be done, but the only question is, again, knowing what that time is. So if it's a different AED than what fire or EMS uses, fire or police use, then that could cause a bit of an issue until you know. But the principle is just the same. As long as you know that time, you turn it on and you wait for the synchronization. And then you're off to the races, because then both devices are using 2-minute of CPR intervals for your analysis.
Yeah, you don't want to use your Timu cottage AED that's got a, right?
Well, no, exactly. And what, many services, I've heard many services in the States have talked to me about, what's the easiest way to do it? So, some have a manual defibrillator and they just put a second AED on the truck. Do you know what I mean? So they need it. So you have a second AED right there. Way more cost effective than having 2 manual defibrillators, right? So you have the AED right there. Many, obviously, as we've talked about, have fire, have police AEDs that can be used. So again, for us, I think in North America, other than probably the really rural areas, I don't think a second defibrillator is an issue. And I do believe that in those rural areas, that's where you would do vector change. We're pretty strong. I think one of the issues, and we have these controversies in DSED, and one of them is vector versus DSED. What should you do first? And we think that the study findings are quite clear that DSED is a superior strategy if you have 2 defibrillators, and that's the if. So if you don't have 2 defibrillators, I think vector change is totally fine. And if I had a patient who had 3 shocks, and I don't have a second defibrillator, we would teach vector change until a second defibrillator got there, and then move to DSED if ROSC hasn't occurred. So here in my area, so we've taught our fire services how to do vector change. And the reason we did that was one of the reasons that the trial was actually stopped. We were in the peak of COVID. And what was happening is we had 50% of our paramedics were off with COVID. 50% were an offload delay. So you had services randomized to DSED. By the time the paramedics got to the scene, fire had given 4, 5, 6 shots. In my career, I never saw anything like that. Most of the time in our service, fire gets 1 or 2 shocks off. You would never see 5 shocks. So theoretically, what you were getting is you were getting patients who were randomized to DSED, getting it at shock 6 or 7, exactly like observational research. And that led the Data Safety Monitoring Board to say the protocol now in COVID really favors the null hypothesis, meaning it favors standard as opposed to the DSED infector, where the critical piece was really doing the defibrillation as early as possible. So I think by teaching fire how to do vector change, what we've done is ensure best we can that a patient goes into refractory VF and PO region, gets at least an alternate strategy, DSED preferred, vector until DSED can get there. So I think that's a good process. And fire, obviously, you can imagine they're pretty juiced up because now they do something different. So I think they're pretty excited about it. And really, vector change isn't rocket science. I think vector change is fairly simple. I think the most important thing that often gets missed is that the most important thing is really when you get those initial AL pads on, make sure that lateral pad is lateral enough, right? So, we see, you guys have probably seen these lateral pads are in the left lower quadrant. They're over the spleen. You really got to get into the axilla. You really got to get into that anterior axillary line to put that lateral pad there. But again, I think some interesting stuff has recently come out, from my good friend Mo Dye in Portland, that looked at AL versus AP as the original pad position for patients in VF. And that trial, although observational, wasn't a randomized trial, suggested that AL is in fact the better position. So it was better for ROSC. It was better. ROSC was a primary outcome. Survival, etc., were not were part of the secondary outcomes, and they were really powered for that. But you need ROSC to get survival, and it does look like AL was probably the better position. And we have many sites I know of in the States who do DSED with AL as a starting position. And the reason they do it is many in the States use mechanical CPR, right? So when you're putting pads on in mechanical CPR, it's easy to put the posterior pad with the posterior plate of the Lucas, of most used Lucas. So it's easy to do that all at the beginning. So then after 3 shocks, it's easy to just put AP pads on without even disturbing the Lucas device. Do you know what I mean? So I think technically, AL first, AP first, AL second with the Lucas device is technically easier to do. Is it as effective? We didn't study that, right? So that's my out. I don't know if it's more effective. I think it's interesting, but this recent data does suggest AL is probably superior, and I think most paramedics out there right now probably AP is more superior. Sorry about that, but I think most paramedics right now likely do AL first. I think AL is quicker, right? But I do believe technically, even in a well-placed lateral pad, you don't defibrillate as much of the ventricle with AL as you do with AP. And I think some of our work in terms of wide dose VF or double sequential work suggests that the transthoracic impedance in the AP pad is significantly less than it is in the AL pad that previously failed. Like what we saw in the trial, and this will come out in some secondary work we're doing now, there's about a 30% drop off in impedance in the AP pad. And remember, when you look at defibrillation, it's not energy that actually makes difference, it's current. It's how much current is going through the ventricle. So if you drop impedance, same energy, you're having more current go through the ventricle. And I think that was a real, likely the reason that double sequential actually makes a difference.
It's amazing you're saying that, because one of the most common questions we get in the CME is, that's awesome that double sequential vector change is superior, but why don't we start with it?
Yeah. So very good question, right? So people say that. So there are now four ongoing research trials that I'm part of in Europe. In Sweden, they're doing DSED versus standard with DSED after one failed EMS shock. In Norway, they're doing DSED as the original shock. In Denmark, their trial is going to start out standard versus vector versus DSED after one failed EMS shock. And in Germany, they're doing a trial DSED versus standard after three shocks, very similar to dose VF. So there is research out there going to look at that in terms of whether, in fact, earlier DSED is better than standard defibrillation, which is really, really cool. It's a different research question, so people need to understand that. The research question we looked at is DSED and refractory VF. Now people are looking at the question of, is earlier better, and should we be doing it earlier, just as many of your students have asked. So tell them I'm part of these trials, and hopefully we give you some information back. And the Europeans are very, very into DSED. They're the ones who are doing the future research. So it's been a pleasure sort of speaking around the world and speaking in places that are doing these trials and giving the researchers sort of our experiences in terms of the challenges they may have in doing this. And I think just like our study, the paramedics are really enthusiastic about doing it, right? Again, it's the idea of doing something different. And many of them are really focused on getting it on early, right? So early depends on two paramedic service, two paramedics there, or two teams, two defibrillators, all the same stuff that we've just talked about. That's what needs to happen. So I think over the next a year or two, we'll start getting the answers to this question about is earlier DSED perhaps more effective?
I think that kind of brings up another question as well in terms of, if we continue to see the benefit of this, and I think you talked about earlier, it's rare that in resuscitation research, do you find something that you actually go, oh my gosh, this is actually making a huge difference. We should do this. Do you think it will inform industry? Because I think, as you mentioned, perhaps our very remote areas of Northern Ontario, they may not have access, and there is an access issue around defibrillation or the number of defibrillators that are available. Does this begin to inform industry from the perspective of, do we create a monitor that's capable of doing dual defibrillation on its own?
Yeah, you're definitely going to see that. I think what you're going to want to see, and I'm working a great deal with industry now. So I think with industry, I think this, first of all, industry hated us, okay? Particularly Stryker completely despised us, okay? So I think they were very concerned. And remember, they had a letter out to their EMS services that if they did DSED and the defibrillator was damaged, that they wouldn't honor the warranty. So you can imagine, hey, you got a couple small services out there that don't have a lot of defibrillators. They're going to say, shit, man, I'm not doing this. Even though I think it may be beneficial. So I remember in the day when we first started this trial, Paul Dorian and I, Paul Dorian's my at St. Mike's. He's a professor of cardiology, a real EPS guru. We had three EMS services that were Zoll, three EMS services that were Stryker. We had to go to these Stryker services and say, hey, if you do DSED with this sequential technique, not simultaneous, but sequential, fast as you can, we knew there was zero chance of damaging defibrillator, zero. And thank God that those EMS chiefs agreed with us, or you guys wouldn't be interviewing me. Someone else would be here today. But they were good. And then I think now, as time has gone on, as others have looked at our data, as people are starting to see some of the secondary stuff we've put out that kind of looks at why double sequential may be superior. I've worked with many of the defibrillator companies, and they've seen the files. And I think that's the issue. You can look at the results, but when you see the actual defibrillator file and see what happens to VF when DSED is given, that changes a lot of minds and people who are really into the fine nuance. I think you will see a day where there's a single defibrillator, 4 pads, or a different configuration of pad that allows you to do AP and AL at the same time. Press one button and 2 shocks given at a separation of about 70 milliseconds. That's what we found is the optimum 70 milliseconds, and that's been shown in animal studies. I think you're going to see that sometime in the future, especially if you see early DSED is better. I think you'll see that. They don't tell me anything, but I know that's going on behind the scenes somewhere.
It's an interesting point as well. So the 70 milliseconds is kind of that threshold. Any thoughts on why that would be the case? So what's happening after that 70 milliseconds if there is the potential delay?
So the 70 milliseconds really came out of animal research. Okay, so what we did, we published some work looking at this timing issue, right? And prior to dose VF, we were doing simultaneous DSED, the technique that theoretically blows up defibrillators, right? And I'll talk about that in a second, but we were doing simultaneous DSED. We did the sequential, and we did sequential because we knew you could never damage a defibrillator. What we didn't want to do in dose VF is enroll 15 patients, blow up a defibrillator, and then the manufacturer said, "I told you so." So we did sequential for that, knowing that that may not be the most effective mechanism of doing it. So in dose VF, we compared, the timing was about 600 milliseconds. So it's less than a second, it's about a half a second doing this rapid sequential technique. But we found that the time when we were doing it simultaneously, we were at about 120 milliseconds. So we had a proportion that were less than 70. And what we found when we compared to do, ROSC rates were higher in the shorter time frame.
Right.
So what that actually tells you is simultaneous is probably more efficacious, but it does carry a minuscule risk of defibrillator damage. So when we published a paper on defibrillator damage, we surveyed pretty well everyone who had published on the topic of DSED. And we did this survey, and we found obviously lots of people who had been doing it, but we looked at about 1,100 uses of DSED. There were 5 cases of defibrillator damage. And this isn't the defibrillator blows up, the motherboard won't shock. So we had 5 cases where there was defibrillator damage. All of them were simultaneous. There has not been a single reported case of defibrillator damage using sequential DSED ever. It's never been reported. It's never been reported because it can't happen. And even if you think about this, if you use simultaneous, the rate was about 0.1 to 0.2% of shocks. So to me, I think I might take that if I can save a life. Do you know what I mean? And then have the defibrillator go back to the manufacturer to repair a motherboard. I think saving a life is probably more important than that. So that's where that information about the 70 milliseconds came about. And I do believe that there are still those out there, because I don't think Stryker's ever changed that letter. So they're still out there that people believe it. Interestingly, Zoll has put out a letter now to their customers that say DSED is an off, we know that the paper's out, but it's an off-label use of the device, right? So when you're a defibrillator manufacturer and it's an off-label use of the device, you're not supposed to promote that use until it becomes on-label. So we've had meetings with the FDA to look at it becoming an on-label use. But what they've got in this letter, they say, although it's an off-label use, if you're going to do it, here's how you do it. Here's where the pads go, and here's how you do the shocking. And they don't even mention warranty because they know if the pads are right, and you switch, there's nothing to worry about because you're not going to damage anything. And it would be good to see other defibrillator manufacturers take a similar approach. We acknowledge it's off-label, but if you're going to do it, here's how you do it. And I think that would help a lot of people who sort of sit on the fence, not because they don't want to do it, because they're scared about this warranty issue.
That's a good bridge to an operational question we get all the time. If we do double sequential, which monitor should they defibrillate first?
We always did AL first, and we were very consistent. So we always did AL first, AP second. And usually, the AL defibrillator was the first defibrillator on, AP defibrillator was second defibrillator on. The other people ask about energies, so we always try to dial up the second defibrillator to maximal energy. So if it's a Zoe, you have 200, the second one would be 200. But in occasion, the paramedics would forget to dial it up. We didn't really care. It was really more important to get that second shock. So best practice would be to dial up to the highest energy. And even if you forget to do that, I still think you're going to have an intervention that is likely going to be effective.
We always get this question too, and let's just say logistically you don't have a lot of resources, but you have enough to do double sequential. Should the ACP focus on double sequential or drugs?
Double sequential. It's so funny that you bring that question to me. Okay, so I just before coming on reviewed I reviewed the IVIO trials that just came out of ERC. So with ERC, they just published in New England Journal just yesterday the results of Paramedic 3 and the IVIO trial in Denmark. And these IVIO trials and the Paramedic 3 trial both showed no difference in outcomes when you used IV versus IO for epinephrine. I know most of us use, I think most still use IV, but there are plenty of places that use IO. So this concept that you can get drug in quicker with IO was interesting. When you looked at these trials, there was no time saving. IO versus IV. There was a higher proportion that actually were successful with IO first, but actually when you looked at the time, there was no time saving between the two. I think the issue is, and I think what's probably the funniest and answers your question, we're looking at getting in a drug quicker that has never been shown to improve survival. Amiodarone, we're looking at getting drug in quicker that's never been shown to improve survival.
Yeah.
So I think drugs have not been shown to improve survival. Defibrillation has been shown to improve survival. So I would always optimize defibrillation. Remember, we had in this trial, remember I said ALS and BLS took part? We had 8% of our patients that were BLS only. No IV, no epinephrine, no amiodarone, no advanced airway. And the survival rate in that group was 50%. We had 50% survival in a BLS-only cardiac arrest and refractory VF, unheard of. And that shows you, and it really crystallizes your question, it's defibrillation that matters, not the drugs. So I think that's the important piece for people to take away from this.
And what do you think's occurring? Like there could be a slew of pathologies, but if you do 3 standard defibs and 3 double sequentials and they still haven't converted, like what would you recommend at that point?
Yeah, so what we recommend at that point, it's because we kind of want to change the scene time, right? So I think 3 standard, 3 double sequential, we usually teach people to get off the scene at that point. We do tell them to do DSED en route. So we usually keep the 2 defibrillators on. So we usually one stop en route. We'll do a DSED. I will tell you, we've had a number of survivors who've had 5 or 6 DSEDs. So I think that's important to know. I think the other options, there may be something else going on that electricity may not help that may be of benefit in the ED. So I think that's important. And I think most of the bang for the buck DSED, most of the survivors are that first or second shock. So interestingly enough, so people say, wow, what were the ROS rates and stuff? So we looked at a shock by shock analysis. So what happened at shock 4 when you had the first DSED and shock 5? And our ROS rates were like 75% for DSED. Crazy at shock 4, about 50% at shock 5. But more importantly, our survival rate at shock 4, so first DSED, was like 70%. It was insane, right? So I think that gives people, investigators who are doing research into earlier DSED, some hope that there could be of some benefit. Because you got to remember, when you're looking at improving outcomes after one shock, a lot of it when you're doing research is based on what your sample size is going to be. And your sample size is going to be based on what's the benefit of the intervention already being used. So when we calculate our sample size for dose VF, we looked at at shock 4, you were going to get about a 12% survival rate using standard defibrillation. This was based on our own data out of Sweden's registry. And at the end of the day, standard defibrillation was 13%. So we're pretty bang on. But so we looked for the intervention to be about 8% better, which is monstrous, right? Most trials, you're looking for about a 5% clinically relevant benefit. So people would say 5% would be the minimum you'd look at. We looked at 8%. At the end of the day, the benefit was 17.1%. Absolute, like that's insane. But I think when these people are doing trials looking at early DSED, they have to factor in the fact that After one shock, you may get 60% survival. Two shocks, 40% survival. Is DSED going to be better than that baseline as opposed to 12%? So that's where the challenge is in drawing up these trials. And the other challenge, too, is many of these places in Europe have very good community responder programs. So there's much higher use of bystander AEDs in these programs, right? So many of these may get ROSC much earlier than we would generally get in our system. So I think we didn't count bystander AED shocks as one of the three shocks. So that's something to think about. Many people who are in systems with higher rates of bystander AED may have lower rates of refractory VF because they're getting shocked earlier. And I think that's important. One of the things we're going to publish on very shortly, I think probably is most interesting, is the thing that makes a huge difference in survival is how long you spend in VF. So your time in VF is critical to survival. The more time you're in VF, the more low flow time you have, the less perfusion to the brain, the worse neurological outcomes. And so this study done many years ago showed time in VF was critical. And what we're going to publish shortly is show that DSED and vector change as well. When we looked at 1,800 shocks. The time in VF was way less in DSED than vector change, DSED than standard defibrillation. We think that is a huge reason why you see the benefit. Less time in VF, better perfusion to the brain, better survival. So 1,800 shocks is a very tedious process to look at, but it was very, very clear. What happens with standard defibrillation, very, very commonly, it'll terminate VF for a short period of time, but 10, 20 seconds later, most of them, 50% of them are back in after 30 seconds, are back in VF. So to me, the defibrillator manufacturers will say that's successful defibrillation. Someone goes back into VF, that ain't successful to me. I don't care about 5 seconds. I want permanent termination of VF. And that's what DSED does better than any other form of defibrillation.
I think perhaps that is a piece of the information that we are potentially missing from the education that we're at least delivering here, is that the difference between a ROSC and the permanent termination of VF and VTAC. Can you share a little bit more light on that in terms of what we're looking at in terms of dual sequential defibrillation compared to standard defibrillation? How impactful is that in terms of not seeing it come back, not just the ROSC or the survival, but it not coming back?
It's complete. It's the key. It's the key. So part of this paper we're going to show is that the proportion of patients who get ROSC after a DSED shock compared to that after standard, you can't compare the two. The proportion that stay in VF after DSED compared to standard, you can't compare. So with standard defibrillation, they stay in VF more commonly. In DSED, they get ROSC much more commonly. And this is looking at each individual shock. So what happens with DSED, to prevent refibrillation, you really got to annihilate every myocyte. So you have to stop them all from fibrillating, right? So commonly what happens with standard defibrillation is you keep some myocytes still defibrillating. And what you'll commonly see with DSED, when you look at the file, either they go into ROSC right away, so they get a perfusing rhythm, or they go into asystole. They knock out everything, and about 30 seconds later, you start seeing QRS complexes coming. You know what I mean? And then you start seeing the patient have a pulse, and the paramedics document pulses. So there's two mechanisms we see. You obliterate everything, and then the patient's natural pacemaker takes over. So their SA or the AV node takes over. Or these patients just immediately terminated because you've terminated all the myocytes that actually do it. So it's really the burden of the ventricle that you're actually getting. I think with DSED, you might have a much more homogeneous distribution of current than you do with standard defibrillation. I think what happened really, guys, is I think the defibrillator companies fell asleep on biphasic defibrillation. They figured we got biphasic, the world's beautiful now. And what it shows you is that there are, in my mind, better ways to defibrillate than simply biphasic defibrillation, and DSED may be one of those.
That's awesome. I think the other thing that you mentioned is promoting the transport of both of those monitors. So obviously the patient remains in VF or VTAC, then we will consider that. Now, if we picture the patient who does have ROSC and does go back into a VTAC or VF, in that case, do you think we have enough evidence now to say, well, we should keep doing dual sequential or vector change because it works?
Yeah, 100%. So what we did in the study, once we committed to an intervention, we never changed it. So when you were committed to DSED, we never took off the second defibrillator. Okay, so we kept it on, and we would never do. You got to think of the paramedics, right? It's be so confusing. I got randomized to vector change. I got ROSC. Now I'm going to go put AL pads on again, right? So we'd blow tons of pads, and we'd be very confusing to paramedics. So once they committed to an intervention, they stayed. And if the patient rearrested, then they did whatever intervention that was still on for them. There may have been one or two agencies who had a health and safety issue about the second defibrillator on. So I think just make sure with your health and safety group that they know where to station it. So it's most safe for the paramedics in the back of the rig. Right. So I think that's important. So you may want to bring that by. But that's what we did. So we never went back to AL. You stayed in the intervention that you're randomized to. And what we did find, and one of the little nuances that, you can't put in New England because there's so, 2,500 words, is vector change did have a higher rate of rearrest than the DSED arm. So I think what that tells you is direction is important, but some people just need more energy. Yeah. Some people just need more energy, right? And I think it's not just the vector, but you need a combination of the two. One alone may not be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just drives that point home of what you said, right? Of the time in VF is the killer here. So, whatever you can do to prevent that is so beneficial.
Yep, 100%.
Can you speak about what are the main causes of patients to be in refractory VF? Like when they get a ROSC, like where do they end up going?
Yeah. So what we found in refractory VF, 85% in the trial were males. Okay. And that makes sense. And the reason it makes sense, if you think about defibrillation, as I mentioned, defibrillation is dependent on current going through the myocardium, but current is related to transthoracic impedance, right? So most males have larger chest walls. Most males will likely have more hypertension, have more cardiomyopathy, have more LVH, less likely to respond to standard defibrillation. And that's why I think refractory VF is more common in males, because they have that substrate, so to say, that makes that ventricle much more difficult to defibrillate. So I think that's why you see these patients go into refractory VF. It's just we don't have great mechanisms to get current to that myocardium with standard defibrillation. But I think it also kind of makes sense in terms of going with that AP pad first in those patients. So I think after I know dose VF, I know our impedance stuff, and I know the Portland paper, I wonder if we should be thinking, this is good, this is the first time I'm going to bring it to you guys, I wonder if we should be leaving the initial pad position to the discretion of the paramedic. Meaning, if you've got someone who's got a smaller body size, maybe use AL there first. If you got a larger guy, maybe use AP there first, because it's more likely that larger individual is going to have a greater transthoracic impedance and less likely to actually benefit from AL defibrillation. So I think that's some interesting stuff. The other stuff that's interesting is I think there are specific VF waveforms that we know now are more likely to be refractory VF. So these are patients that we look at with what we call AMSA. AMSA is the amplitude magnitude, a spectrum. So basically AMSA is a measure of the chorousness of VF. So that fine VF, those are going to be much more difficult to defibrillate than chorus VF in general. And I think some work out of Seattle has been really interesting, and it's been able to show that you can use machine learning, AI, to be able to look at that original rhythm before you've even given a shock and say, hey, this rhythm is going to be tough to defibrillate or very easy to defibrillate. And for those that you use AI to say, this is more likely to use refractory, we shouldn't waste time with standard VF. We should go right to DSED for those patients. So I think those are all the new and upcoming things that you may see in the future of defibrillation for this technique. If you've got someone who the defibrillator tells you is going to be tough to defibrillate, go to DSED, go to an ECMO strategy if you live in an area where ECMO is possible. Don't waste time with standard defibrillation. And I think this is interesting. When we did publish some work just recently on this idea of shock refractory versus recurrent VF. So when we published this work, we looked at a pragmatic definition of refractory VF. So shock 2 minutes of CPR, shock 2 minutes of CPR, shock 2 minutes of CPR, and you're always in VF. For us, that was very easy for the paramedic, right? That was easy to do, and that's what you wanted. But EPS people would like to tell you that these aren't really refractory VF. The real refractory VFs are those who you shock and they never come out of VF. Okay, so they shock, never come out of VF, whereas our cases were more likely to be recurrent VF, where the patient was shocked, came out of it for a short time, went back in VF. And recurrent VF has always been taught if someone's in recurrent VF, it's not a defibrillation problem, it's a CPR quality, they have an LAD lesion that needs to be opened up. There's a lot of issues, but it's not defibrillation. So what we did is we looked at the dose VF patients and we separated them out. We looked at all the ECGs, separated out to refractory versus recurrent. So the refractory group was about 18% true refractory, recurrent group was about 82%. What we found in this truly refractory group, not a single survivor who got standard defibrillation, not one. Okay, survival was about 30% in DSED. But even then, when we looked at the recurrent group, the survival rate was 10% absolute higher for DSED than standard defibrillation. So regardless of whether you use a pragmatic definition or an EPS definition, DSED was a superior strategy. So I think that really feeds well into this technique of looking at the ECG early and being able to know, maybe we should go to something earlier.
It kind of goes back to what you're talking about pad placement. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I really feel badly because my computer is low and I don't want to move it because it may screw up your whole scene in the background.
It's probably a good place for us to wrap it up anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, this was fantastic. I'll tell you why this was so great, guys. Your questions were fantastic, very open-ended, but it allowed me to delve into a lot of the stuff that we've learned about DSED that we actually probably didn't know at the end of the trial, and allowed me to share that with your paramedics with the hope that they now understand why we do DSED, understand the mechanism better, and I think will likely save more lives for patients in refractory VF in Durham region. So really thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and if anyone there has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Sheldon.Cheskes at sunnybrook.ca. And I'm happy to share with you guys our training videos, and you may find them beneficial, particularly with those AED issues. So I'll send those after the call.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think that having that understanding of how it works and the deeper understanding, people will not only appreciate it more, but I think they'll just be more amped up to do it. So it's awesome.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
And as Dale was mentioning earlier, it's so hard to move the needle in resuscitation research. And you've honestly and your team done incredible work, and it will save lives. It has saved lives. So thank you so much for coming on and discussing it all.
Great. Really, really happy. Thank you so much, guys. And like I said, any questions, happy to be there for you folks.